it also, I think, is really important because it completely turns on its head in underlying assumption of so much of classical literature. It's this pursuit of making yourself immortal through great deeds, through glory, right? I mean, that is one of the central things that Achilles has to wrestle with, right? He's very famously given this prophecy before he leaves for Troy. It's like, you can either stay here and you'll have a very happy life. Your wife and kids will love you. Your grandkids will love you. You'll be happy. Then you'll be forgotten. Or you can go to Troy, live a short time, and do great deeds and be remembered. And obviously, Achilles chooses to be remembered. So your quotation takes the exact opposite assumption that the greatness doesn't come from the renown. It's from doing acts which may or may not be even noticed in their time. Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and, wait a sec, Troy loses? At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is wondering if he should have given a spoiler alert before saying that. And that's me, Matthew Mullema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, in our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. Listeners, I want to take you deep into the dark recesses of time, all the way back to early 2024. During that time, we managed to book an interview with A.D. Rhine, the author of the critically acclaimed novel Horses of Fire, a novel of the women of Troy. A.D. Rhine happened to be in Colorado Springs and was hanging out with the Anselm Society. And just so we're clear, by A.D. Rhine, I mean the writing duo of Danielle Stinson and Anselm's own Ashlee Cowles. They have like two heads, but the same writing. I don't know. It's like something out of Greek mythology. I'll think of the good analogy soon. But anyway, as part of that Colorado Springs visit, we scheduled a podcast interview with both Danielle and Ashlee. But here's the thing. All four of us Believe to See hosts, me, Mandy, Christina, and Evangeline, we all wanted to join the interview because we all love the book. Now, for those of you who are familiar with podcasts, you'll know that this math does not add up. You simply cannot have 6 people on a podcast and have it be listenable. Scientists have been trying for years and it just doesn't work. So one of us would have to step aside for the good of the podcast, and that person was me. Was my deed admirable? A model of podcasting virtue even? Well, obviously it's not my place to say, but yes it was. And so the interview took place without me. Let's fast forward to today. A.D. Rhine has published Daughters of Bronze, the second part of their Women of Troy duology, in the conclusion of the story that began with Horses of Fire. And this time, obviously there's no way I'm going to be left out of this interview. So I reached out to Ashlee myself and got it on the calendar myself. And also Christina's along too because that's just more fun. Christina, my first question is for you. Do you feel guilty about excluding me from the first interview? And if so,
Absolutely not.
why?
No, it was a girls' club. You weren't allowed the first time.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
well,
sorry. We like you a lot, but we have to have our girl things, you know?
I wish I could say that's the first time that's happened to me, but I get it, I guess. All right, so now let's bring in Ashlee Cowles, the author herself. Ashlee, how are you doing? And did you feel bad for me?
I did. You were missed, Matt. You were missed. But like Christina said,
so
sometimes girls just have to have conversations on their own. But I'm glad you're here now.
Wasn't there some like movie rule where a movie's not feminist unless there's a scene where 2 women are talking without a man present about a subject other than a man? Are you familiar with this rule?
I am familiar with it. I cannot remember the name.
Well,
but
that was our
that was the rule. Yes.
Yeah, that was our podcast. Meeting this rule. So there we go. But anyway, let's get back to the main point here, and that is A.D. Rhine. So talked about how you and your friend / writing partner / other half of this writing duo, Danielle Stinson, wrote the book. What is the best creature of Greek mythology to compare you to? Are we thinking a Hydra, or like you're one head, she's another head? Or is this like a chimera? What are we looking at here?
That's actually what I was gonna say. Is I think the word you're looking for, Matt, is a 2-headed Hydra, and we were actually introduced at a conference that way. So we'll just keep that metaphor going.
That's fantastic.
All right. I'm glad we have that settled in that it is just in the canon right now. So let's get started. Let's do the author question. All the novelists come prepped for. So Ashlee, Horses of Fire, Daughters of Bronze. What's your book about? Give us the elevator pitch.
So Daughters of Bronze is the second part in the duology, and it is a retelling of the Iliad, but we say it's a historically rooted retelling of the Iliad. And it actually covers the part of the story that probably people are more familiar with. If you've read the Iliad or, the children's version of the Iliad growing up, or if you saw the wonderful movie Troy, you you may, you'll recognize certain beats, certain parts, certain characters from the story in this book. Whereas Horses of Fire we think of it as kind of like a prequel. It's a 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And so we, asked ourselves if this war was based on an actual event, which many scholars believe is very plausible, how would it have actually happened? And so Horses of Fire looks at kind of that 10-year stretch. And then Daughters of Bronze is the couple months that Homer's Iliad. It's a very long epic poem, but it only actually covers the very end of the war. And so that Daughters of Bronze gets into the epic battle between the Greeks and the Trojans and how it all ends, the Trojan horse, all the things, from the mythology that people are familiar with are in this second book.
All right. So, listeners, let me give a quick caveat because, like I mentioned, the first interview with Ashlee and Danielle was posted in February 2024. So some very discerning listeners may notice we're going to retread some ground here. And if you pick up on that, great. You're a very dedicated listener. We're happy to have you. But we are going to retread some ground here. Okay, just so you know, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Let me ask the question that I'm sure was asked in the first interview. What about the Iliad really captured your imagination and Danielle's imagination? What made you think, I'm going to turn this story, one of the most famous stories in the world, into a historical fiction novel?
Yeah. So I think we've been talking about it for years. So Danielle is my childhood best friend. We met on Army base in Germany when we were 15. And I think it's important to know, like, to give kind of a picture of our friendship, we spent a summer sitting side by side on the couch reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And so, actually like reading a lot, like each with our own book and then like talking about it every couple pages and then going back to reading.
Cute.
My dad walked in the room and goes, "You two are the biggest nerds I've ever seen." And then proceeded to leave. And we were like, "Thank you, Dad."
Thank you, Daddy.
Yes. So we have a love for epic stories. I think, growing up as military kids, we grew up watching kind of all the old epic war, not old, I say old, the 90s epic war movies, Braveheart, Gladiator. I guess those are probably considered old now, but
The late 19...
Yes, exactly. The late 1900s. And so I think that is kind of the vein of storytelling, the type of stories that brought us together, that solidified our friendship. But we each kind of had our own journey with the Iliad in particular. So Danielle's started very early. Her dad actually would read the Iliad to her mom out loud while Danielle was in utero, and sometimes would walk around the house reciting the opening lines, "Sing to me, muses of the rage of Achilles." He would just like burst into random, performances of different lines of the Iliad. So she grew up with hearing it. I had a much later introduction, and I was actually teaching at a classical high school in Fort Collins. And the ninth graders, we spent the entire first semester of ninth grade classical lit reading the Iliad. And, reading it in the sense that they were assigned 10 pages a night, and then we'd come back to class, sit in a circle, and discuss those 10 pages. And we had lots of debates on who's the hero of the Iliad. Is it Hector? Is it Achilles? And I just remember walking into the class one day, and my students had written on the board in a big heart, Hector plus Andromache, and a big heart surrounding it. Yes. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, someone has to tell this epic love story. And so that was kind of the conversation Danielle and I had. She married a soldier and said goodbye to him. He was deployed to Afghanistan a few days after their wedding. There's just moments in this story that I think anyone who has had a loved one who's gone off to war is like, this is thousands of years old and it still hits with the same emotions. It still feels so true. And, it is known as the warrior's epic. And so I think, that's where it started. That's where we each kind of had our own journey, but then our shared background, our shared love of the same kind of epic stories. We finally decided during COVID, when all of our kids were home, that was the perfect time to start a 2-book, historical Bronze Age epic.
All right. So, one final question just to set things up is your decision to make this in historical fiction. So, like grounded in history to the extent possible. Because there's other adaptations of these sort of myths. I'm thinking of like Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller that keeps a lot of the supernatural elements in it. Yours very much grounds it in a lot of realism. So, what made you decide to go that direction with the story?
I think we were always interested in the human actors. We always, the gods and goddesses kind of on the battlefield, treating the human beings like puppets and kind of interfering in the war. That was never as interesting to us as the people. And we we started when we started to dig into the history, or ask the question, was this war based on something that might have actually happened? We were surprised that, opinions have changed about that over time, but that is what many scholars think, is that there was likely a real event, a real war, probably not on the same scale of what we see in the Iliad, but that some kind of conflict occurred around 1250 BC. And so this is actually several hundred years before Homer is composing the Iliad. And so even he was, several hundred years removed from the events as they actually happened. And it's only recently with, recent archaeological discoveries that more has been learned about this, pretty opaque period of history. There's a site in Turkey called Hisarlik, and that is believed to be the site of the real Troy. And there's just lots of interesting things where, Homer, he is not writing historical fiction, obviously, like he doesn't have historicity as his primary goal, recording things accurately. He's trying to tell a tale of warriors and their heroic deeds. He's not necessarily interested in telling us what exactly happened. But there are details, things like where he describes the weaker wall, one of Troy's weaker walls, and then archaeologists have found that it actually lines up with what Homer said. So, we thought like there is something really interesting about bringing the actual city and the actual people to life, because Homer really portrays his Trojans in the Iliad. You can't tell the difference between them and the Greeks. They all seem to be basically the same culture. They worship the same gods and goddesses, whereas the real Trojans, the ancient Anatolians, would have had, their own pantheon. And so we thought it would be an opportunity to explore some of those cultures of ancient Anatolia that the Trojans were likely based on, and to ask probably the most interesting question is, why this story? Like, why was this event the story that had just survived for thousands of years, and it was so important just throughout Western civilization? There must have been something pretty pivotal that happened to create a mythology around that event. And we can kind of get into what our different thoughts on what that might have been the late Bronze Age collapse. But that really is what sparked our interest in wanting to tell a historically grounded story of Troy.
Okay. All right. Well, I actually was really interested. I love historical fiction personally. And I think there's something about it that really can take things about humanity and ground it in ways that we all identify with. And so when you take history and you take today, like current day, like an author, right, living in the current day, and you combine their knowledge of the human psyche and their experiences of today with history, if you have a good writer like you and Danielle, in my opinion, you can actually do some really powerful, marvelous, moving things with the characters themselves. And so you had talked about wanting to do these people justice in these stories. And that was partly what was so good. Now, I think as far as the world building itself, like I'm sure Matt probably has a couple questions about that world building, but excellent. A++. But I was really intrigued in the characters. And I know it's no secret as far as the previous podcast, et cetera, that a lot of your characters were based on women. Some of the women took center stage. And I was really curious why you guys chose to do that and what kinds of results you were kind of hoping to get. We did cover a little bit of that again in episode 1 of this duology, but I think it's a really important angle, and I wanted to dig into it a little bit more for readers because I think you take a very unique approach, and I'd like to hear more about it.
Yeah. Well, there's some layers there with why we chose. The story is told from the perspective of 4 women. So I should probably just explain that. So we have Andromache, who is the wife of Prince Hector, and she's also a trained military strategist. In our version, she was mentored by Amazon warriors. We have Rhea, who is I guess you could say a horse whisperer of sorts, and she is a servant girl in Troy who finds herself in the household of Hector and Andromache. Then we have Helen of Troy, who is the character who needs no introduction, but we wanted to take a really unique angle with Helen, who has long been blamed for the cause of the Trojan War. And then we have Cassandra, who is, the doomed prophetess of Troy, who sees Troy's end, but is cursed so that no one will believe her warnings. So those are the four characters. And we didn't look, over the years we were discussing writing the story. We didn't say, oh, we're going to write from the perspective of the Trojan women. There's an author, Pat Barker, who's done a beautiful, I think hers is a trilogy, from the perspective of some of the women in the Greek camps. And, so that is, it is a trend in publishing, but that wasn't necessarily to tell these well-known stories from lesser known characters, which often happen to be women. But it all started with talking about one specific scene. And to go back to kind of my high school classroom, the Hector and Andromache love story. And so probably one of the most famous scenes in the Iliad is from book six, the farewell scene between Hector and Andromache. And that was, it's Hector's getting ready to go fight, and he believes this might be the end for him. And Andromache is basically, she has her infant son in her arms, and she's saying, why now? Because she thinks Hector is doing what he's about to do, out of pride more than anything, and that he doesn't need to be so reckless in this moment. And so it's a very moving scene. And when we're talking about it, we're like, who is that girl holding their baby? Who is this servant girl? And that's where Rhea, the character Rhea, was born. And so it all kind of it was all around that moment, that one, it's kind of like C.S. Lewis, where he sees the lamppost, and then Narnia is born from there. That's kind of how this was. It was like that one scene, and those three people, actually four people, coming together and saying, like, what, there's so much more to unpack here in this little family, you could say. And so that's where the story began. And I think we were probably encouraged to write from the perspective of women, because that was something readers were wanting to see. We always like to say, like, the story started as like our love letter to Hector, because that was the character that both Danielle and I always gravitate. We probably saw our dads, being soldiers' daughters. Like, that was the character we always gravitated towards and rooted for. And what was so interesting about the four women that we chose is they are all connected to him, and so it was almost like we always wanted to tell Hector's side of the story, because Achilles gets all the glory, but it just felt natural to tell his story through the perspective of these four women who he has relationships with. And in the actual epic, he's one of the few characters who interacts with them, who is shown interacting with all of these women and talking with them and having conversations with them, which we thought was very interesting. So so that's why we made that choice.
Okay, that's very cool. What about the quote at the beginning or the end of the book? How did that play in?
Yes. And I wish I had it in front of me so I would read the entire thing, but it's a beautiful quote about, basically the heroes who rest in unmarked tombs. And so I think that was a motivating force as well, is this idea of telling a story from the people who are working tirelessly behind the scenes, but who may not, the Sams.
Yeah.
Of the story, who may not, be called the hero, but their actions are having an impact, and the world may never know. And that, thinking of the walled city of Troy, and then thinking of like what it's like to grow up on military installations, like you see the people who are the ones that are left behind, but they're coming together. It's a very tight-knit community. There's lots of sacrifice. There's lots of acts of love and charity. But those aren't the things that are going to win medals. Those aren't the things that are necessarily going to be highlighted.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny because that that I remember now, because that quote was, I think, in the front cover of Daughters of Bronze.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And so that had not been published yet. It hadn't been read yet by any of us when we did your first interview. And I remember when we ended it, I was like, you guys, you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of this quote by George Eliot. And you guys were like, no way. Yeah.
Yes.
But I'll have to find it and read it. But
You
but
got
yeah,
it, Christina. You were like tuned in.
I'm gonna look at it. I need to read it because I think so much of that quote, like it just says so much about the characters in general. But
Yeah, and it also I think is really important because it completely turns on its head in underlying assumption of so much of classical literature. It's this pursuit of making yourself immortal through great deeds, through glory, right? I mean, that is one of the central things that Achilles has to wrestle with, right? He's very famously given this prophecy before he leaves for Troy. It's like, you can either stay here and you'll have a very happy life. Your wife and kids will love you. Your grandkids will love you. You'll be happy, then you'll be forgotten. Or you can go to Troy, live a short time, and do great deeds and be remembered. And obviously, Achilles chooses to be remembered. So your quotation takes the exact opposite assumption that the greatness doesn't come from the renown, it's from doing acts which may or may not be even noticed in their time. And speaking of another aspect of this, where you're flipping a convention on its head, it's Andromache and her Amazon heritage. I want you to talk about this because what I find absolutely fascinating is how we in our society view Amazons completely different than the ancient Greeks did, right? Because the ancient Greeks, they thought the Amazons like this tribe of women who get by, without men, who go to war, they do all this business stuff. We view them now, it's like, oh, Wonder Woman, yeah, kick butt, girl, that's great. But the Greeks viewed them as monsters. It's
Monsters.
like, oh, that's hideous. Look at what those women are doing. It's awful. Some male hero needs to go set them right. Oh, good. Hercules is there. He'll set it all right. Good. So it's totally a different thing. But you cast Andromache in this sort of Amazon type role. So please explain to us why you did this and what you hope to accomplish thematically through that choice.
Yes, so she's the character who, it's a story. Her story is one of motherhood. And so we thought it would be really interesting to have, and probably something that would resonate with modern readers, to have her struggle with moving into that role. And so we're like, well, what is the most opposite what is the most opposite thing we could do, like, to create this tension of she is going to become the mother of the heir of and she's not sure how to do that, how she feels about that. And I think the other thing was that her and Hector have presumably been married for the 10 years of the war. And Astyanax, their son, is described, as their only child. And so it was interesting to think of, like, did she struggle with infertility? Was she resistant to the idea of having a child? And so part of giving her that background was something for modern readers to connect with, that whole journey of becoming a mother. But it was her, in the end, making the sacrifices that she needed to make for her son and for Hector. What was interesting about, as we looked at that, so Andromache's name means battler of men, which is a good description of her personality. And really, I think how this whole train of thought got started is there is a line in the Iliad where it says Hector listens to her counsel. And so we thought that was really interesting, is like she's giving Hector counsel, behind closed doors. What are they talking about? And so we never wanted her to be a warrior on the field, because that wouldn't fit with what how the Trojans were. But we wanted her to have that military, like the strategy. And so having her be an Anatolian princess who comes to Troy to marry Hector, but comes from a different background, that led us to the Amazons. And what's interesting is that many scholars, there's been archaeological discoveries of around the Black Sea, of graves of women warriors. And I believe many scholars believe these aren't, like the Amazons, tribes of women only, but more like egalitarian tribes, nomadic tribes that traveled together, that were both the men and the women were warriors. And so that was, we wanted to take the Amazon legend and then also ask, okay, what was probably some of the more realistic, plausible history behind this, if that mythological figure was based on something that actually existed. But it did provide an interesting contrast, because the roles of women in Anatolian society are a lot different than the roles of women in Mycenaean Greek society. And so once again, when we have kind of Helen and Andromache coming together, Mycenaean Greek and a Trojan, they're coming from these different backgrounds. So it creates like this point of, another point of tension and conflict.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the big decisions you made for this series is how you're going to characterize Helen's relationship to Paris in the cause of the war in general, right? Because one of the ongoing debates, because it's kind of ambiguous from the text, was Helen kidnapped by Paris, or did she go of her own free will? Is it kind of a little of both? It's again, that's been a debate for millennia. The what was it, 2004 Ridley Scott film Troy made the decision that Orlando Bloom is Paris and whoever she was is Helen. They're just super hot and super in love. So isn't that great? So she goes willingly. You went the exact opposite, where you make it clear that Paris kidnaps Helen. Helen goes because she has no choice, and Paris does this specifically to start a war. So why did you decide to go that route? And did you ever toy with maybe they're in love?
Yeah, I think we'd seen that version enough that we were like, let's try something different. Maybe, maybe she's doing this to save her 9-year-old daughter, not to leave her behind. And so that was the angle we wanted to take. But it goes to looking into, as we started digging into some of this history, finding other interesting theories that could maybe explain like a reason for the Greeks and the Trojans to have a war. And I mentioned the late Bronze Age collapse, which was, this time where in the late Bronze Age, where cities, mostly in Mycenaean Greece, but in Egypt, other places, these pretty advanced civilizations, they had a pretty steep and fast decline. And there's, where they entered basically a new dark age. And scholars don't really know why. Like there's theories of, is it climate change? Was it these roaming bands of basically pirates called the Sea Peoples who were going around sacking all of these cities? There's
I love
lots
the
of
Sea
different
Peoples.
Yes, they make an appearance because we definitely wanted to give them a nod. But so as we started to kind of, think about how we wanted to kick off this war, the geopolitical reasons seemed so much more interesting to us than a woman sees a hot Trojan and decides to like leave her kid and run off with them. And then is hated and blamed by everybody for thousands of years.
Yeah, I could just see it's like this woman, the Queen of Sparta, she leaves her husband and daughter, just goes off with Troy. Well, that's not plausible. What if I told you that Trojan was Orlando Bloom? Oh, I'm listening. Yeah, it doesn't quite work. Even with Orlando Bloom, that doesn't quite work. But
yes.
But yeah, I mean, to be clear, I think that's totally the right choice thematically. But it was one of those early choices you had to make that sort of caused everything else to branch off from it. And another thing that I really loved, it was an emphasis on sort of the back scenes of war, right? Because we're used to in the Iliad and pretty much every other epic, we're talking about the warriors battling on the plain, right? That's the emphasis. But when you look at it, there's a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes. I remember I was watching a YouTube video where some historian was analyzing whether the Battle of Helm's Deep was plausible. And this may shock you. He found some historical inaccuracies. But one of the things he said was, because there's the scene of like the women and children cowering in the caves while Aragorn's being, he's fighting and stuff. And he's saying like, that's just not going to happen because in a war for survival, everyone's going to help in some way. Maybe you can't fight, but you can bring water to the troops. You can help provide medical aid to the troops. You can put out fires. You can bring arrows. Everyone needs to be doing something. And that vaccine stuff is actually really vital. And you really highlighted that with your approach. So what motivated you to really emphasize the sort of backstage of war and how vital that is to the process?
Yeah. And I mean, even more so than that, we wanted to highlight like actual tactics that might have been used in Bronze Age warfare. And so, you mentioned not giving away spoilers, but I'll just say, our take on the Trojan horse is probably a little bit different than what listeners may be expecting, because we thought, I don't think the Trojans are that dumb. I think maybe if they saw a giant horse, they wouldn't, sitting outside their gates, they wouldn't necessarily just pull it right into their city. But we thought, what does that symbolize? What is, as a mythological symbol, what is that saying? And so we tried to take, again, a different angle on how the Greeks might have infiltrated Troy. But, as to your question, again, the archaeology kind of helped form how we portrayed things, because we know how the city of Troy was structured, and there was a lower city that didn't have as much fortification. That would be where just the average person would be living. And then there's these rings of Troy, and as you go up into a citadel, where there is a lot more. It is kind of like the Helm's Deep of Troy. So as the story progresses, the people have to move further and further into the center of the city, because they're losing. But in those early stages of the war, we wanted to show how if you were in the lower city, you would be putting out fires, you would be participating in some way. Young boys would be fighting eventually at some point. But it does change as the things get worse for our characters and becomes a little less. They start to lose hope. But another interesting thing is that we have tunnels underneath the city of Troy. And that was based on there's all these systems of really interesting tunnels throughout Turkey. And so that was something we wanted to kind of nod to, is those structures that are all over Cappadocia and Turkey. And to have that as another possible means of fighting this battle. We have these underground, basically a city underneath the city, which allows for espionage, which allows for other tactics. So the city itself, I think, dictated how we were going to portray the warfare.
And again, just kudos to you for all of that historical research. I think meeting like historical accuracy with like character development can really be incredible and really well done. So kudos to you guys for that.
Thank you. And it's fun when you find that the actual history is even more interesting than like what you could think of, what you could make up, when it actually provides details that you
Right?
wouldn't have thought of on your own if you were just like creating this as maybe like an epic fantasy story.
Yeah. I mean, it's like our God was pretty cool and made cool people who had cool ideas and cool innovations, and
They dug underground tunnels, and yes.
I know. It's been created for creative for thousands of years. Imagine that. It's pretty great.
Yes.
Hey, I found the quote. I found the Middlemarch quote. Okay, here we go. Da 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 da. Here we go. All right. The full quote from this section. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs.
Pretty much sums it up.
Yep.
That reminds me, I think another thing we wanted to go back to your question about showing the lesser known characters, kind of the people working in the shadows behind the scenes. Another thing that let us explore is just a different take on warfare, because Matt, you mentioned Achilles is going to fight for immortal glory, and that's many people argue that the Iliad is actually an anti-war epic, but when you look at the characters, they're fighting for personal glory, personal immortality. That's the main motivation, and that's why the story largely focuses on individual warriors and their great deeds on the battlefield. But I think showing the perspective of women and showing the perspective of we would obviously want our male warrior characters to have the mindset on war of the time, the Greek idea of kleos, glory. And that was not something we were going to change, but it's a hard view of war for, I think, modern people to grasp and to understand and to connect with it all. We have, I think, most people have whether they know it or not, probably have closer to a Christian just war idea of war that developed in the Middle Ages. Whether they would call it that or not, like I think there's probably a lot of people who think war sometimes has to happen. It's sometimes necessary, but it's an evil. It's never a good thing that we want to happen. And so having, the women characters and the allies, we have a lot of Troy's foreign allies in the story who come from all these different lands, and they have, a lot of different takes on war, and they come from different cultures. That allowed us to bring that perspective in. One of the very first scenes in Horses of Fire is Andromache challenging the idea of, why are we just going out and fighting, man to man, when they're raiding all of our villages? if we defend the villages where all of our food supply comes from and defend the innocent people who are being slaughtered, maybe that will turn the tide of the war. Why do we keep doing the same thing? And that's not, that is not a perspective of a Greek or Trojan warrior at the time. And so having these kind of outsider characters allowed us to, I guess, maybe insert some of the questions about warfare, and also to show it in a way that modern people probably can have more sympathy towards, or at least bring up those questions that we're more likely to wrestle with.
It's interesting when that we're going back to the movie Troy. So I was a big Josh Groban fan. I just loved his voice, and he sang a lot of like songs that Matthew,
Danielle-
what is your face saying right now? What is that face?
Danielle and I have seen him in concert 4 times. So
okay,
together.
all right. I have someone on my side here, Matthew Millema.
I literally said nothing. I said nothing.
No, your face said everything.
Said everything. He has a great voice, Matthew.
He has a great voice. And so when I was first introduced to that song, Remember, I didn't realize it was from the Troy movie at first. And that was before I really kind of understood really that Greek idea of immortality being remembered, right? And the song is called Remember. And it's such a beautiful and like haunting song. And once you sort of understand the sort of the you could say theology, but like not theology, but like the concept behind why they believe that, it becomes, first of all, like you become sympathetic to it, not in the sense that you necessarily like that you like believe it, but in the sense of, wow, I can totally see how an idea like that would be attractive to a people like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that whole concept of, dying for glory, and if you remembered, that's how you live into forever, right? That is memory, really. And so I think that in and of itself is really cool, that you used sort of the concept of that quote, the George Eliot, the small acts, the people that we don't remember live in those unvisited tombs. It's that history is owed to those people, and not the whole notion of glory. And it's really a very Christian. So I thought it was a very brave thing to do for you guys to sort of take that approach, but it was also extremely seamless. It just made so much sense, because you didn't take away the Greeks, vision, and they didn't take away that vision for battle and glory and all that. It was clearly there in your story and the culture, but you had real humanity featured so beautifully that it all made so much sense together.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
and I'm going to piggyback on that, Christina comment, because one of the things I found so interesting is this book, it's not a Christian book, obviously, but you can tell that it is infused with your Christian worldview. And like you mentioned, Ashlee, the Christian view of the world is just diametrically opposed to so many aspects of the ancient Greek view of the world. So how did you go about trying to create a book that's infused with Christian thoughts in a world that would find those thoughts just alien and strange?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Subtly. It's, yes, and I would say even in this genre, it's a very, very different from all because mythology retellings are very popular right now. But I think what they're saying is a lot different from what we wanted to say. And what has been gratifying is that people from all different backgrounds, people who are not Christian but who love reading mythology retellings, are struck by something like, there's something different. There's something, and they don't necessarily know how to name it, but they're seeing feminine rage is the big buzz phrase in this space.
Circe was justified in turning those men into pigs.
Yes.
Yeah, one of those
and
things.
And that was exactly what we wanted we wanted to show the exact opposite, that love is so much stronger, that is such a much stronger force than rage, that, rage is Achilles' downfall. Rage is the downfall of the characters of the original story and our story. And that, again, that's, I think, where Hector came in. I think when we kind of, I'm going to try to talk about this without giving anything away, but I think I can allude to it. He is definitely the sacrificial Christ figure. And that always felt like what he was, even in the original. And so there's a moment when he goes to have his last stand against Achilles. And if you don't know how, it's several thousand years old, so I'm sorry if you don't know how it ends, but Hector does not win. But he is portrayed as this throughout the whole story as this noble defender of Troy, this, he is never going to turn his back on his people, his father. He's like the exact opposite of Paris. And how he's portrayed in the original is that when he goes to face Achilles, he turns and he runs. He suddenly loses all courage and he turns and he runs. And that never felt true to us. That never rang true. That felt like that is what Homer needed to happen, but it never felt like it true to his character. And it's interesting teaching kids, and they all say the same thing. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Why does he do this? It doesn't feel like Hector. And so that was really an opportunity for us. And I'm not going to give this part away, but we wanted to, again, flip that on its head, but it was already there. So it didn't feel like we're imposing our Christian worldview on a story. It felt like there were already the seeds of that story already in the original, and that Hector always was kind of the antithesis of the Kleos, the glory achieving immortality idea, that he was always the counterpoint to that. And so this was just an opportunity to, I think, when it was probably the most amazing writing moment of my life, like when we were having the conversation, we're like, this is why he does it. This is why he does it. And so, yeah.
That's so
and yes. And so it's one of those examples of, the Christian story is baked into every great story. And we just had to do a tiny little twist. We didn't have to change everything to pull that thread and to show that, the idea that love and sacrifice are what achieve immortality, not glory, that was already felt like that was something that was there. That we just emphasized a bit more.
Yeah, we're running low on time, but final question along those lines is that just something I kept thinking about as I'm reading the book, because I'm no expert, but I'm an Iliad enthusiast, so I know the story, I know what's going to happen. So the whole time you see the relationship between Hector and Andromache and Cassandra and his son. There's just this doom hanging overhead, right? Because it's like the whole time it's like, I know it's gonna happen. I know it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. Oh, there it's happening. That was not Achilles. That was Patroclus. Oh no, Achilles. So and that was just one of those things I kept wondering, like, how are they gonna pull this off, right? How are they going to have a good and satisfying ending when we know, based on the source material, all of their characters are doomed in a sense. So without giving specifics away, no spoilers, but how did you guys approach that just really, really difficult task of coming up with a satisfying ending in that circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back
and to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
I was going to emphasize what Matthew said, because it was another question that was related, which is the same question, it's just emphasized. Given Matthew's question, and given that so many people only read a book if they think it might have a happy ending, I feel like you guys had an uphill battle. And so I'm just basically adding to Matthew's question, and now please answer that.
Yeah.
That's a tall order.
And a lot of readers who read the first book, they would reach out to us or interact with us on social media. There was that same kind of feeling, like, I want to read the second book, but I'm really scared because I know the story. And that, it was a difficult, a very challenging task, but that it was also so fun to say, how can we make people think that the story is actually going to turn out differently? Like, because we wanted it to feel like, wait a minute, are they going to change it so that Troy actually doesn't fall? Like, we wanted that doom to that, that sense of, I know what's going to happen is obviously going to be there, but we also wanted there to be enough, I guess, freshness for it to make people believe, who know the story, that it could actually turn out differently. And then as far as, how we did end up handling the ending, I think this again goes back to the two girls reading Tolkien on the couch. And we always said, we want to Tolkienify the Troy. Like, that is our goal. We want the eucatastrophe. We want an unexpected, small, but powerful, ray of hope at the end. And so that it's not everything is tied up with a nice bow. It's not happily ever after for everyone. As Matt said, the major characters, the names, if you're familiar, how the story ends in the myth. And we mostly kept with that. But there was an opportunity to infuse the ending with some hope and to make those, all the things they did have meaning. And I think that's, what we wanted to say, those small acts in the shadows, they did mean something in the end. They did do something. And so, yeah, it was a tricky thing. It was very difficult, but it was also one of those things that I feel like is like a once in a lifetime. Like, I don't think I'll ever write a better ending. Not to say like that, I don't think it's like, it did feel like something about the two of us together, like our friendship and the conversations. Like, I could have never written that on my own. It never would have. It felt, inspired. It felt like the Holy Spirit was, I don't want to be like over dramatic, but it did. Like, when we came to that realization of how we were going to end it, it was like, doesn't come from us. Like, this is not something we could just pull off on our own, or even with just the two of us. But yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, listeners, we are sadly out of time now, but in case me and Christina have not been quite blatant enough, please read these books. They are fantastic and we love them.
Yes.
So,
Thank you, guys.
Ashlee, aka one of the heads of the Hydra that is AD Rhine, where can we find you? Where can we find your writing?
You can find everything at adrhine.com, and we have a book club where we do kind of monthly book giveaways and emails. So we're taking a break from social media. So that is the best place to find us.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again. And listeners, as you can tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you have polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have just a little bit of extra time right now, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.